So I just beat Slitterhead, and I can safely say that this is the overlooked, jank, ambitious 7 out of 10 of the year that 100% deserves your attention and will be a cult hit. It's one of the few games that genuinely feels like it fell out of time and is keeping the spirit of the PlayStation 2 alive. I don't think it's going to be a game for everyone, as there will be likely a large number of people who are turned off by the very clear budgetary restraints and lack of polish. It's an extremely experimental game that I can forgive a lot of its foibles because it's taking risks to do something unique and unconventional, even if it never reaches its true potential, and may fall flat on its face multiple times throughout your playthrough. The closest comparison is I would call Slitterhead 2024's Gungrave Gore. Gungrave Gore isn't nearly as experimental with its gameplay, but if you watched my review on that game, then saying this will have already painted you a picture when I say that Triple G's shortcomings are all present in Slitterhead, down to both having the same sporadically placed CGI cutscenes that are much higher quality than the in-game cutscenes that shows you clearly what they wanted the game to always look like and be like, but couldn't due to the restraints, down to even both having the same blue color grading. This is mostly going to be a spoiler-free review outside of on-screen visuals of all of the playable characters, along with talking about some of those characters' mechanical aspects. I'm going to be talking about the story in very specific detail at the end, but there will be a warning so you can go into this game blind and not walk into these spoilers unknowingly. This is a game that is very lacking on the presentation front, which is going to turn off a lot of people. They have a very small amount of character models outside of the named cast members. These nameless NPCs often look like upscaled PlayStation 2 models in the worst kinds of ways. You know, the ones that make people go, it looks like a PS2 game as an insult. And all of them are Control-C, Control-V copy-pasted every 2 inches to populate the crowded city streets. You are going to see the same shirtless fat dude having a conversation with the same old lady in front of a stand run by the same old man and woman 2 feet away from the same old man and woman walking past them into a crowd of themselves. The closest analog to what they look like is the Destroy All Human remake's designs for NPCs. Personally, this didn't really bother me that much. I just accepted that this was going to be a thing and didn't detract too much from the game having an overall cohesive aesthetic. Like, yeah, it's not ideal and I wouldn't be against having something better as long as it did not come at the cost of the game's stellar art direction, but overall it's not that big of an issue unless you're going out of your way to make it one, and you're the type of person to really obsess over high fidelity graphics wanting to see every single pore and hair follicle on a character model's scrotum. That's not to say you aren't likely going to notice it, it's pretty standout, and even I have my fair share of issues that I'm going to be complaining about with the game's presentation, but I personally just laughed it off and thought it was kinda funny, and moved on with enjoying myself and the game. The game completely allows you to just walk into cutscenes as any of these NPCs and doesn't force you back into the actual playable unique characters, so you can easily create situations where you are face to face with the destroyer of all life as we know it and be staring them down as a plastic left out in the sun Play-Doh grandma that doesn't emote because the model is physically incapable of doing so. It's hilarious. There is also very little voice acting. It's only present during the pre-rendered CGI cutscenes and a single moment in the actual game. Otherwise, they use a very awkward mix of voice mumble akin to Animal Crossing or Banjo-Kazooie, and random words like in not fully voiced JRPGs, sometimes having nothing to do with the sentence on screen, unlike the JRPG conversations where they would say at least a word or two from the actual sentence you are looking at. It took me like an hour to realize this because initially I thought the main character's spirit, who has a filter over their voice, was just talking in Japanese or Chinese, and the effects were so bad and there was so much shit going on in the cutscenes, from explosions and characters arguing and monsters transforming, that I couldn't make anything out clearly. Turns out it was a string of gibberish that became much more apparent in later in-game cutscenes where there was less going on and the effect wasn't as oppressive, so I could hear that those weren't actually words. There are a few instances where you'll randomly hear English words amongst the gibberish and voice mumble, and every time it always caught me off guard. Part of me wonders if this is just the voice mumble simulating something that sounds like a word that I understand in English and not actually an English word, but this is what it sounds like. Which way? No,
Which way do you feel I should?
The rest of the time when it isn't literal gibberish, it's all grunts and groans and will likely take you out of the moment when the story is trying to impart to you its complex mechanics of how the monsters work, and the voice mumble is just actors barking. Multiple characters make the weirdest barks and moans as placements for voice acting. It really hurts the impact the story and characters could have when they are making sounds that cause me to pause the game and laugh about it while I'm streaming it to people. It feels like these are placeholders because they didn't have the time or budget to get voice acting for everything. Otherwise, why would they have this one hallway segment at the very end of the game have voice acting, but nothing else?
From the depths of despair, a savior appears.
When I see stuff like this and the things that I'm going to bring up in the rest of the video, I can't help but think, man, imagine a timeline where Sony didn't kill off Japan studios and all of the money they burned on Concord they gave to Toyama's team to make this with the budget it deserved. I'd honestly be happy if they added in the voice acting in a patch later if the game sold well enough so they could actually finish it, even if this does perpetuate the practice of games coming out blatantly unfinished and are patched over the next 2 years from their release until they're at the point they should have been at when they came out. The voice acting or lack thereof is merely one of the many aspects of Slitterhead's jank that has me saying this game could have used another year in the oven. This person on Backlogged put it perfectly that it's Xenogears Disc 2-like. Most of the story is told via these conversation memory things, where you have the character of choice spin around in the center of the screen while they converse with the spirit you play as. Occasionally it fades between close-ups and wide shots of the character in varying poses, and most are super goofy. The rest of the story is told via the subtitles that you have to try and juggle reading during combat because of the lack of voice acting. It's unfortunate that this is all they have because as a result, some of the characters get a lot less characterization and are just kinda introduced in the story, like Blake just shows up. Alex and Julie are easily the most defined characters, and that's not to say that the others don't have stuff about them and to them, they just don't get as much screen time. I also don't know what the conditions are to unlock conversations with the other characters. Like I had already beaten the game and gotten the true ending and only went back and reopened the game and replayed a level just to get some extra footage easily because I needed to script something specific to happen, only then to exit that mission and see that there was a new conversation to get. I had already thought I'd done everything the game had to offer, but I'm getting something that is giving me more backstory about characters like Blake and Donnie. Nothing big enough to make me change my opinion of what I just said, but this is stuff I would have wanted to see before I got the true ending. This is simply hurting your own character writing because if I didn't have to go get this specific footage, I would have never saw this. So as a result, they feel a lot more like a supporting cast rather than people you're working with side by side, initially framed to be supposed main characters. That the main story halts all progress and requires you to go back and recruit them. The soundscape feels incredibly lacking. The music by Akira Yamaoka is great, but like with Gungrave Gore, it feels like there is just a ton of effects missing that create a disconnect that you would never notice when done right in other games. I'm talking about little things like impact effects from jumping, hitting, and combat sound effects from your weapons. We are interacting with sound at all points in our everyday life, so when you see something like this do it poorly and have things missing, it's going to create the uncanny valley effect in the same way that bad CGI does. It has this very specific low-budget sound to it that makes in-game cutscenes feel incomplete in the same way that Gungrave Gore's did. Let me play a few examples because you just have to hear it to fully understand. What I'm about to show might be considered spoilers, so if you don't want to see any, jump to this time code.
學死人咩？好恐怖啊！
Slitterhead is a game that I feel can't be properly conveyed from its trailers. I'll be upfront about how after I watched the gameplay reveal back in June, I was pretty uninterested in the game and thought that the combat did not look very fun. Originally, I wanted to say that I thought that the game was not marketed well or marketed clearly, but after going back and re-watching that trailer for the first time since June, it does actually show everything that is in this game as it is. It's just the simple fact that it's one thing to watch a game and another to actually get your hands on it. But if I did have one criticism that I do think is true about this trailer, is that they made the combat seem a lot stiffer. They are just not moving at all. They're making it seem slower than you can play it as. Maybe this is how they intended you to do so, but framing it like this makes it seem a lot more limp and rigid than it is in reality. And when this is the only gameplay and combat trailer out there, not to mention the only combat trailer that is on the Steam page, I can't help but imagine that a lot of people were turned off by this. I was originally one of those people, but my opinion only changed because I tried the game anyway, thinking that if I didn't like it, as long as I only played 2 hours, I could refund it and move on with my day, which I would imagine the average consumer doesn't even do this and won't risk it on consoles where you don't have that refund option. For all of this game's jank, the thing they did right is make its core gameplay idea and loop feel so smooth to play and be cool and stylish as hell as a result. There are a lot of games out there where it feels like the actual act of gameplay and playing the game is priority number 3 through 10 on the list of the devs' objectives, where they did all of this work but didn't make the game fun to actually play, or they made a fun combat system but trap it in tons of things that make it annoying to go back and replay the game. Slitterhead is the inverse, where there are clear sacrifices around the edges, mostly in the presentation department, but the game A, runs well, its performance was solid and stable even while I was streaming and recording it at the same time. The only time there was any hiccups in the performance was when I would use Betty's Blood Lance ability that would turn every pool in the arena into a weapon. If it hit multiple enemies, yeah, it would drop for a few seconds, but nothing major. And this would only happen if an enemy got hit by multiple pools at once, as the frame rate wouldn't move if only a single pool was turned into a spear to hit an enemy. This is nothing compared to the performance issues of Dragon's Dogma 2, a game that also came out this year. I really liked Dragon's Dogma 2, but it ran terribly anytime you were in any of the cities. And this is a game where certain weapons have frame-perfect follow-up attacks, or the Callisto Protocol, which would run at sub 10 FPS at launch, and stayed that way even after multiple patches. The other thing is that Slitterhead just plays well. Obviously, there are still a few hiccups about the gameplay which I'll get into, but I have to say Slitterhead is one of the best releases to play at release. Over the past few years, there have just been so many games to come out and simply be broken at launch and make playing them not worth it until 2 to 3 years later after they've been patched to an acceptable state. COVID did affect a lot of studios and their releases, and we are going to likely keep seeing this effect for a while since games take so long to make now with 4 to 10 year dev cycles, but I'd say I only ran into 2 bugs, or at least 2 bugs that I actively noticed. One where random NPCs didn't have combat barks when I took control of them and made them attack, further adding to that lacking soundscape issue I just touched on. The other was during one of the challenges where a character's cooldown kept fluctuating and resetting, and I don't know why. Maybe it's some facet about the ability that I missed or wasn't explained if it's not a bug. Either way, it made the fight impossible because you have to keep turning off the challenge boss's curses, but the ability to ward off spells would just not come off cooldown, and enough debuffs would stack that I would just die and not even get a chance to use it again. I honestly had no idea what to expect with this game going in, and I can safely say that I was not expecting the twists and turns it took in both mechanics and story. It combines so many different things from all over the place regardless of genre, medium, or time period to make one of the most inspired and unique feeling games. I can point to aspects of it that remind me of other things, but as a full package, nothing is quite like Slitterhead. The game as a whole feels like a kit bash of the dev team's favorite stuff, as it continuously captures the feel and vibes of tons of manga like Chainsaw Man and Tokyo Ghoul, anime like Parasite or Shiki, and late 90s, early 2000s Japanese horror films like Pulse and the Ju-On series. It's a body-snatching third-person horror action game that is like a cross between Pikmin, a real-time version of Yakuza 8's combat, The Third Birthday, or Drive San Francisco, and delivers on the fantasy of just controlling random people to do an uprising like Watchdog Legion initially proposed but failed to deliver on, along with the sprinkling of like 20 other things. You have the uniquely named characters, which are referred to as rarities, those who can fuse with the spirit you play as that body hops from person to person but retain part of their consciousness when being controlled, and as a result get blood-based powers in the process. There are 8 in total, one which you have to go out of your way to unlock, who is undoubtedly the best and funniest character in this game. I love running around as Queen Elizabeth just slashing up penis monsters. The characters vary from aggressive melee or ranged combat focus with a mix of single target or AoE abilities, and more supportive characters with either healing abilities or buff givers / debuff removers. Some of the characters are sadly a lot more fun to play as than others. As much as I love boxing and martial arts, the drunken homeless boxer, which is basically just Danpei from Ashita no Joe, is in contention for the most unfun character to play in the game in my opinion, only being rivaled by the other fist-focused character Tree. I'm not really sure how you pronounce this character, and since there's no voice acting, I never got a confirmation. Their ranges are so short and the hit feedback of the game isn't very satisfying to begin with. Parries feel limp as hell when they actually work, as even by the end of the game I couldn't fully ascertain the timing needed to consistently pull them off. Get a perfect parry enough times and it activates the worst feeling witch time I've ever experienced. Most of the enemies don't react to your attack, so combine the 3 things I just mentioned together makes it so Edo and Tree feel incredibly stiff and awkward compared to characters like Alex, Betty, and Julie. If you are playing this game for an action game to do stylish combos in, or even for an action game that, while basic, is really satisfying and fun to play like No More Heroes, then you are going to be disappointed and not going to have a fun time. The combat is at its best when you are in a large arena fighting a boss with a bunch of NPCs to jump between, and you fly all over the place as you feel like you are controlling each individual hero in the Wonderful 101 on the ground floor. Nothing quite feels like Slitterhead once you get into the rhythm of jumping from person to person, using their abilities and more or less stun locking enemies from all angles. It's a shame that you can only control 2 rarities per mission instead of either a few more or control all of them by the end of the game, so you can layer together all of your unique abilities as you jump from person to person to do cool tag battle mechanics like Chrono Trigger. This is still doable if you take 2 aggressive combat focused rarities at the same time like Alex and Blake, where I was still doing crazy gun combos by placing Alex's gravity well to draw in all the enemies, then swap to an NPC to make them into a dive bomber and run into that gravity well, then jump to Blake and use his revolver or minigun. This shit is so fucking cool. Just watching my video is not doing enough justice to convey how fun this gameplay loop is. But even in describing this, I can't help but imagine how chaotic and fun it would have been if there wasn't this restriction to 2 party members. I would have loved if this was even a post-game unlock to just give you a reason to replay the game. Instead, as a result, a bunch of characters ended up getting ignored by me, unless otherwise forced to, like certain missions where you are made to take specific characters and combinations to push the story forward. Maybe this is something to consider changing in an update or possible DLC. It feels like Julie is someone you always want to be taking with you because one of her passive abilities is to turn off friendly fire or hitting random human civilians. Anita feels basically unplayable without her, since her whole gimmick is calling in more civilians with her demon scent ability, then turning them into auto turrets to attack the boss all at the same time, while you don't have to have control over them. But if you don't have Julie to turn off friendly fire, then they all deal damage to you and you can't get near the boss while they attack, or you risk dying to one of their stray hits. And if they aren't killing you, then you are going to be killing them because they all clump up right on the boss right in front of where you're going to be swinging, which is a wide range since Anita has a halberd. This means if you use her one ability combination and entire character gimmick, you just have to fuck off and sit at the back of the room and either do nothing or pepper them with your poison dart attack, which some enemies resist so it doesn't even do anything. The same thing happens whenever using Alex's AoE gravity well. I wish that character passives just became a party-wide thing or simply made it so friendly fire wasn't a thing in the first place. It's bad enough that the passive system is already pretty bloated, with most of the abilities being the same thing over and over again on each character, with very few being unique that build towards their character's gimmick. It's unfortunate that the current implementation only results in lowering the skill ceiling and fun factor of the combat. The combat is at its worst when it forces you into small arenas or to fight without any NPCs to jump to. The combat already has an issue if your rarity gets downed and needs to be revived. The enemies give you no room to breathe and actually do this, since they always focus you down even if you use the Warcry ability. They also have initial release Dark Souls 2 level tracking, so they will spin across the galaxy to cut your head off. This makes it so if you ever get downed, then it's just your character by themselves because the other rarities haven't caught up yet to the fight, since the AI doesn't follow you at at all for some reason, and it functions like picking Saitama in the One Punch Man Arena Fighter, where you have a timer before they show up, you just get a game over. The game also has a horrible habit of letting you get stun locked and being unable to hit enemies because they don't react to you. It sucked anytime you had to fight multiple of the slitterheads that have the tongue lash attack, or if you had to fight too many of the penis monsters. There is one challenge mission where you have to fight a boss in this boiler room, and it's one of the most frustrating things I've ever tried to beat. If you make any mistakes, it may as well be game over because you have no space or time to ever recover from anything, and the boss takes so little damage, while also practically one-shotting you. The other oddity is how much health bosses have. I don't know what causes it, but the game constantly ping-pongs between paper-thin bosses that can get comboed to death, and then meat walls that refuse to die. Maybe it's based on what day the mission takes place on, but man, some of these guys are way tankier than they have any right to be, given that they are the same enemy that you've been fighting for hours. Maybe if the game had a little more enemy variety, it wouldn't be so bad or egregious, but by the end I was so sick of some of these tanky bosses. While I think the game very intelligently uses the limited amount of locations, spaces, enemies, and scenarios to the best of their ability, making the most out of what they got, I do think the game sadly starts to develop too much of a dependence on these chase sequences that get extremely old by the end, and make replaying missions a real chore. They start out so cool as you are jumping from person to person in streets to scaffoldings to rooftops, trying to get as much damage as each NPC can get in, while the monsters rush through the crowds trying to get to safety. I've never played anything else that has done something like this and captures it in a way that makes it look and feel so cool. It's selling the fantasy of what it would feel like to play through the action scenes of Everything Everywhere all at once. But then they keep doing it over and over and over again with enemies that get tankier and tankier, that take more and more out of the way paths through the same city streets, also they can get back to the same few combat arenas for scripted segments. Did I really need to do 5 laps around the town just to loop back to where we started to get into a closed off boss fight for the 6th time? Slitterhead has the sight jacking mechanic from the Siren games, and by comparison, it's basically completely underutilized and feels like it's just there because it's a cool thing that was from the director's previous games and doesn't gel well with the rest of the game's identity. Like, yeah, you use it to triangulate your target once or twice, but you can easily ignore it because for some reason they give you this purple vignette which points you in the direction the Slitterhead went. Why would you have both? One is completely invalidating using the other. It would have been much more interesting to only rely on the sight jacking, so this makes it feel not that mandatory. I would have rather it had been more of an expanded on mechanic that missions utilized to vary things up and have more than one approach to the cat and mouse gameplay, rather than the 20 some odd chase sequences. They initially want to have this invasion of the body snatcher narrative where you don't know where or who the Slitterheads can be, but don't do anything really interesting with it. That's the thing you'll come to realize while playing through Slitterhead, is that it's an action game with horror window dressing rather than a horror game with action elements. Outside of the monster designs and their transformations, which are incredible, anytime the pre-rendered monster scenes show up it's always a treat, there isn't really much horror beyond the concepts. The game quickly abandons the greater horror vibe it opens up with. The game isn't scary and doesn't try to be. It doesn't try to use any of the ideas of how anyone could be these serial killer monsters with no way to track them down and the ability to easily gain a new appearance if they were somehow discovered, to create any tense scenarios and situations. Like the segments where you have to try and find out where this monster is before they kill people quickly become deflated and lose all tension when you realize that the monsters stop moving. Eventually they're going to hit an endpoint and just stare at the person you're trying to save. Maybe this feeling of abandonment of the horror elements it initially starts with is because most of the pre-rendered cutscenes are in the opening and near the end, so the middle is just doing a balancing act between all the different kinds of types of stories Slitterhead is trying to be. From here on out, I'm going to be talking about the story, so here is your spoiler warning. I don't want to say it's a bad thing or that they completely abandon it, but the game does jump between being like a bunch of different things, and sometimes it's a lot smoother than others. There are some very abrupt jumps of what kind of story this game is like. Initially, it seems like an invasion of the body snatcher serial killer story, then it has the there is more to the monsters than we initially thought element, elements, going for something like Tokyo Ghoul, where there are some of the Slitterheads trying to find alternative food supplies to coexist with regular humans, with touches of Nier, where characters are unwilling to see past this and think that they are all monsters no matter what, building to maybe being akin to something like Shiki, where it shows that humans were the real monsters all along. Then it starts to have time travel and time loop elements. Then it shuts down that previous point about the monsters and goes, no, they really were evil all along, and that talk about how this is a facade to trick you is true. They fully reinforce that thing that they seem like it's setting up to not be the case, because they outright say that any Slitterhead that is peaceful and trying to coexist with humans just hasn't been awoken to their primal desires to kill and eat brains. They are a ticking time bomb that will turn them into a rabid monster no different than any carnivorous wild animal. Even the one character that seems to try to fight against it in the end gives in to these urges and kills the human that he loves. Then the story takes another swerve which had me hooked as much as the initial setup, where one of your party members starts to lose it and becomes evil and consumes the consciousness of the spirit. The only issue with this last bit and how the story shifts between each of those beats is how the lack of connective tissue that is in the presentation of voice acting, actual cutscenes, and more character interactions between the rarities or anything that isn't these codec conversations results in the story feeling like there are sudden massive jumps that leave it feeling a bit all over the place. I wouldn't call the story confusing, but Alex going from being a tragically tortured good guy to a villain that is consumed by the darkness that is deep in his heart, losing himself and giving in to his flaws and the hatred deep within him, is a single line of dialogue. You are told by characters you are acting differently from having your conscious connected to specific other characters. Julie tells you how much of an ass, cold, and evil you are becoming from being in Alex's body, rather than actually seeing this happen. Even if this was just a visual novel entirely relying on the words that are written, it would not be enough. You don't get to see any of the actions or the things that these characters are telling you about that the spirit is changing into. You just play a mission that you've already played through multiple times because you're in the time loop, and then you unlock a new conversation where you are told a bunch of things that you just didn't see. I get what it's going for and I adore this story concept, but a lot of this game's narrative is carried by my imagination filling in the blanks and having the context of much better told stories with these given elements that I've seen them be executed better. I respect the hell out of what this game is going for. I think it's so cool that one of your characters turns evil. I love this plot point. You barely ever see this. It is awesome when you actually have to have a duel between Julie and Alex and you fight on both sides of it, and both characters, controlled or otherwise, are using the body hopping mechanic, and how it implements into the boss fight is some of the most fun shit I've seen in years. But it just never realizes that full potential. You see this cutscene where Julie and Alex are running through the city, and like I mentioned earlier, it feels reminiscent to Everything Everywhere All at Once, and it makes me wish that, damn, if only this was fully presented in a way that felt satisfying. If only they had more cutscenes, or hell, maybe this would have been better as a movie or an anime. Maybe then it could realize its full potential. It's so cool, but it's clearly being held back by whatever development restraints they had when making this game. I respect the hell out of this game for actually having the balls to let you get to the end, only to reveal that there is actually a true ending you can get by fixing all of the timeline shenanigans if you manage to minimize the casualties of NPCs and missions, and then reveals that they've actually been tracking how many civilians you've been killing in each mission by treating them as nothing more than tools, weapons that are a means to an end with the sole purpose of killing the Slitterheads, a thing that Julie constantly reprimands you for, and a thing that Alex exceedingly goes, I don't give a fuck, I'll use as many people as I need to kill all the Slitterheads. It further builds on the idea that the game ends on with Alex and Julie being mirrors of each other, Alex becoming more of a destructive monster whose lack of care for others, as long as it kills the Slitterheads, is shown in his ability to turn anyone you possess into ticking time bombs, where Julie has the passive to turn off friendly fire, and one of her core abilities and gimmicks is that she can heal everyone in an area around her. In reality, it's sadly another jank execution that only half works. All I had to do was play a few of the levels where I had a high death number as Julie and keep using her healing ability off cooldown, and only play as her, keeping my risking of civilian lives to a minimum. Even if this came at the cost of enjoying the actual combat, because jumping around is much more fun than just staying stationary as one character doing the same few slashes over and over again in unresponsive combat. And even in doing this, it was still pretty jank because the monsters and chase sequences would just clip into people and instantly kill them, which would increase my casualty casualty count. I don't know how the fuck I was supposed to prevent that, which is why I gave up on the Magic Seal mission where the serial killer was going around and killing NPCs while I was trapped in combat arenas across the rooftop while they kept killing people and I had no way to stop them since I'm stuck fighting enemies with way too much health. I was initially not excited to try and do this after beating the game on stream, but the following day I just kept having the itch to boot the game back up and keep playing it, even though I had already watched the true ending on YouTube because I thought it was going to be a nightmare for me to unlock. I can't say that mini games make me want to do that. The game, in spite of all of its rough edges, was still calling me back to it even after I had finished it. I just wanted more of it because I thought it was cool as hell. It's a game that is awkward and stumbles in a lot of places. It will likely not be enjoyable to the average person, but it's trying something new and has one of the coolest aesthetics out there. It felt like what I wanted Ghostwire Tokyo to be. It feels like a 7th gen Suda game like Shadows of the Damned, which also got a remaster recently, which you should check out if you haven't played that game before. This game made me drop everything and go and make a video on it in the span of 3 days. I can safely tell you that something has not made me do this in a very long time. If you are a fan of Suda51 or Swery65 or just low budget kinda jank PS2 action games, especially if they're from Japan, aka any of the stuff that I usually cover on this channel, I cannot recommend Slitterhead enough. The game is open enough to either get a DLC or a sequel, so I hope this game does well enough that Bokeh Studios still gets to keep making weird stuff like this, keeping the spirit of the PS2 alive. If you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thank you for watching as always. If you really like the video and the channel, maybe consider leaving a like, comment, and spreading the video around, along with considering becoming a patron on Patreon if you want to see more videos like this. All patrons get access to videos a day early, along with a $3 and $7 tier that allow you to vote on multi-game reviews and see rough cuts of upcoming videos. Some of the things that are on there that aren't out on YouTube are stuff like the incomplete Drakengard retrospective and my Final Fantasy XVI review. I'm now going to shout out all of my $5 and up patrons who really help support the channel: Bully, Densha, Turbo Chicken, Scary Dinosaur, Burley, Chikun Highwind, Dev Welkin, Dodgy Haji, Elio Romelio, Fish Kami, Jordan Bennett, Kevin Velasquez, Kohai Carmen, Lotto, Maxi89C, Medi Not the Bad Guy, MGS Duh, Quartz, Samuel Egan, Sayan Heggy, Slemph Tingle, Metal Cactus, Friday Night Fragging, Alec Joseph, Ben Johnson, Buckets, Chichometrius, Cursed Void, Ekphraso, Filthy Finger 69, Hard Leg Joe, Jacob Hamilton, Lazy Titan, Leon, Nicholas Pedinato, Petord Bursky, Shisaji, Tabriz Sadiq, and Neutral Guy. Thanks so much, everyone. As for what's coming out next, I do have my Halloween video that missed the mark by quite a lot. It'll probably be out by Thanksgiving, hopefully. Maybe a little sooner than that. It depends on how things go. But at the very least, it'll be out before the end of November, ideally. I also have a bunch of small videos I want to do. I want to cover Kinitsugami. I want to cover Crow Country. I have a bunch of other horror games like Hollowed Body and some other PS2 stuff like Destroy All Humans 2 and the Neopets The Darkest Fairy. I have a million ideas. It's just the issue of getting them done. But that's pretty much it. If you enjoyed the video, as always, thanks for watching and see you next time.